When you hear the word chaos, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Stress, anxiety, confusion, overwhelm, maybe even a little bit of failure. But what if you reframed chaos into not the thing that's necessarily holding you back or keeping you from moving forward, but as the very thing that can set you free? So today, we're diving into why chaos isn't your enemy, it's your greatest creative weapon. And if you think this doesn't apply to you because you're, quote, not creative, I challenge you to think again, because creativity isn't something that's just meant for the fine arts, music, painting, dancing, whatever. It's something that's meant for everyone. And I think it's important that we define creativity here. And creativity in this context is simply making something new in your life that didn't necessarily exist before. And so this could be a painting, sure, but it could also be a business idea, a side hustle, a new way of parenting, a new way of working out, or even just a different way of approaching solving a particular problem. And so creativity isn't something that's just reserved for artists. It's for anyone willing to create something that is uniquely theirs. Okay. Creativity is something that I find as being a lifeblood for a lot of people, especially if you have a lot of ADHD and you like putting your hands in a lot of different things. And so how this relates to chaos is a really good example is I want to talk about Deidara from Naruto Shippuden, right? My favorite anime, I've got it tatted on me. Okay. And he's a living, breathing manifesto of creativity and chaos. And Deidara, if you haven't watched, whether you like him or not, he's not some run by the numbers type of villain. Okay. He's a mercenary. Yeah, he just kind of out for himself. But Deidara is pure energy, and he's an artist in a sense that thrives in the mess, and a walking reminder that real creation isn't born in order, at least not at the magnitude most of us want. It's forged in destruction and unpredictability. And his explosions throughout the show, they aren't just like attacks. For him, they are art. They're fleeting, it's powerful, and it's a celebration of chaos as the ultimate creative force. And so here's the thing about Deidara is his philosophy turns everything that a lot of people think about in terms of creativity on its head. Most people chase perfection, control, and permanence in their work, right? Absolute order, but not Deidara. To him, permanence is the crutch, right? It's boring. True beauty is in the moment. It's in the fleeting flash of brilliance that burns out as quickly as it ignites. And his art doesn't hang on walls, it detonates, leaves nothing but raw impact and memory behind. And this is apparent in like the craters and the massive explosions that he does and everything throughout the show. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend. But that's the magic of chaos. And it doesn't hold you back. It actually sets you free and allows you to find things in creative ways in your own terms. And this isn't just like a philosophy for a ninja or artists. This is like a secret sauce for anyone trying to create something extraordinary for them. Because let's be real, creativity does not happen in a neat, color coded plan or perfectly polished drafts. It happens in the unpredictable, the messy, the chaotic moments when you stop trying to control everything and just let things flow. That's the lesson that we can ultimately take away that Deidara brings us, and that's embrace the chaos because that's where the best ideas and breakthroughs ultimately live. And so I want you to picture this. You're you're at work, right? And it's a fast paced office on a Monday morning. You know, phones are ringing, emails are flooding your inbox, and deadlines are breathing down your neck. Like there's shit that you need to get done. And your team or your coworkers, they're scrambling. You're brainstorming ideas on whiteboards, tossing out half finished thoughts, and bouncing solutions off each other like a game of creative ping pong. It's absolute chaos. But in the middle of it all, there's usually some form of magic. One breakthrough idea or action emerges from that, and then another. And then suddenly, everybody kind of ignites with clarity and some form of momentum. And maybe this happens in your creative process where you're doing something and nothing seems to be sticking, but then all of a sudden it just takes one thought and and everything starts to flow. And so that's the power of chaos. It's kind of like everything has to build up such to a point where then it forces the actual thing that needs to come out. But that only happens through that buildup. So when everything feels overwhelming in your life, that's often when the best ideas and the best next steps are born. And so now let's just shift to a cluttered artist studio, half-finished paintings leaning against walls, brushes are scattered across tables, and paint splatters cover every surface. And so to an outsider, it looks like a complete mess. But to the artist, it's alive. Each brushstroke, each splash of color is part of a larger process, a creative storm that eventually produces something extraordinary. And the chaos isn't a hindrance, it's the heartbeat of creation. And so this video and this episode is about flipping the way that you think about chaos and creativity. Whether you're building a career for yourself or solving a personal problem or just trying to make life feel a little bit more meaningful, that chaos and that sense of anxiety is your ally. And I'm going to show you why. And so when I started, creating more content and, whatever it means to grow a personal brand, at first I thought I needed like some sort of perfect plan or some perfect action step in order to make things happen. But in reality, it's been the messy and the chaotic stuff and the unfiltered experiments that has made it work up to this point for my life. And this also goes in my professional life in terms of operating a multi-million-dollar company right now. What I've learned is it's not the moments of control that ultimately push you forward. It's the explosions in the plans that you thought were going to work and the failures and the unpredictability that has fueled my best work and the best version of myself. So by the end of this, I hope you'll understand why chaos and why this sense of uneasiness about where the next idea or where the next thing's going to come from is essential for creativity. Okay. And you'll walk away with real tactics at the end of this to harness it. And so we're going to be pulling inspiration from the metal music scene and then the mud-soaked battlefield of Agincourt. And this isn't about just ideas. This is about action and what we can do to do that. So this is where we kind of want to burn the rule book. We want to embrace the mess and build something legendary. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. So imagine you're in Birmingham, England in the late 1960s. And it's not the glamorous world of pop bands and swinging London like we typically see with like the Beatles and all that. Birmingham is raw and it's industrial, it's loud, the air smells like smog, the streets echo with the clanging of machinery, and for most people, the future is a grind in the factories. But there were 4 working class kids. This chaos became the muse. It became their answer. And so Black Sabbath didn't just rise from this environment. They were shaped and molded by it. But, Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, you act as if darkness is your ally. I was shaped by it, molded by it. Same thing here. Black Sabbath was shaped by this entire environment. Their sound was born from the raw energy and darkness all around them. And so Tony Iommi, his accident that he had wasn't just a personal tragedy. This accident was a turning point in music history. Losing the tips of his fingers could have ended his guitar playing career, but instead, it forced him to innovate. He created custom thimbles and he tuned his guitar differently. And so it produced a heavier, sludgier tone that would end up defining Black Sabbath's sound. And this wasn't about like perfection. It was about adapting to the chaos and finding the brilliance within it. And so while other bands were singing about love and peace, Black Sabbath's lyrics reflected a darker reality and the dark reality of the world, war, fear, and the supernatural. And their song, War Pigs, it's not just a track. It's a chaotic anthem of rebellion against the establishment, especially at that time. They took the noise and grit of their lives and turned it into something that spoke to people who felt like the world was falling apart around them. And this brings us into how metal and the energy of live concerts in metal became something more than just concerts to go to. They are whole ass experiences. And so you don't just hear the music, you feel it. right? If like I know my other fellow metalheads are out there, they know what I'm talking about. The amps are cranked up to the max. The crowd is just a sea of bodies, and the air is like electric and chaos. And in the middle of all of it is the mosh pit, which is just a swirling mass of energy where chaos isn't some just tolerated, it's celebrated. Okay. And there's something primal about it. It's a release of everything that's bottled up inside of a lot of people. And so in the early days of metal, there wasn't corporate backing for or polished marketing. Bands were their own roadies, carrying amps, drums from gig to gig. I know there's a lot of metal bands now that they still do this. Albums are recorded and were recorded, especially in that time, on shoestring budgets. And merch was sold out of car trunks. And it was chaos, but it was also deeply personal. And metal, it wasn't, and it still isn't just about the music. It's about creating a culture from the ground up, from the most intimate and deepest parts of ourselves. And a lot of times the parts that a lot of us are ashamed of showing or feel ashamed of showing to the world. And so metal culture, it's not just about the bands. It's about the fans. It's about us who live and breathe it. These aren't just passive listeners, right? We wear battle jackets or whatever you want to call it. We have specific concert outfits that we like to watch that we may not, or that we like to wear, but we may not necessarily wear in public aside from the shows. And you get packed into these tiny, tiny venues and you scream along with your favorite songs. And as metalheads from the 60s all the way up to now, we create our own language and our own rituals and our own ways of connecting with people in a way that's loud and unapologetic just as much as the music itself. Okay. And so for a lot of us, metal, especially heavy metal, whatever you want to call it, it's more than just music. It's a way to reject the mainstream. Okay. Metal, it doesn't cater to the radio or try to clean up an image to appeal to the masses. It's raw, it's honest, and above all, it's just chaotic. And in a world that, especially in the 60s, that demands order, metal, like we revel in this mess. And it gives people an outlet for their frustration and creativity. And so metal culture thrived because it doesn't shy away from what was uncomfortable. The themes are dark, performances are intense, and a lot of fans are just unrelenting in the way that we choose to experience it. And it was a place where chaos isn't just a flaw, it's a defining feature. And so people who felt out of place in the mainstream and in typical society, we find homes in the chaos that is metal music. And especially if you look back over time, and I think this is an important lesson for if you are a creative person to embrace the inner chaos, it's because metal teaches us you don't necessarily always succeed by being polished or perfect, especially if you're different. You succeed because when you embrace that chaos of the overall human experience, the grit, the noise, the imperfections, they're not obstacles. They're the fuel for something revolutionary for you. And your creative process doesn't need to look like anyone else's. And you don't have to go to YouTube and just find like how to create a system to be creative or other people's stuff. Let the chaos and the fact that you don't know what to do be your guide, just as it has been for Black Sabbath and all of the metal bands that have came up. And so another spot in history we can look at in terms of your back being against the wall, everything's chaotic, you don't know how the hell you're going to move on, that we can look into is the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And so Henry V, all right, at this time, King of England, and it's October 25th, 1415. And imagine this. You're standing in ankle-deep mud, okay? You're part of the English army. You're tired. You're hungry. You're soaked to the bone after weeks of marching through enemy territory. At this time, it's the French. And across the field looms the French army. And at this time, the absolute juggernaut in Europe, it's the army's 5 times your size, and it's brimming with knights in gleaming armor. Okay, they've got horses, manpower, and the confidence that comes with knowing that you're supposed to be the one to win. You're the big man on campus. And everything about this situation screams defeat for you and your comrades. But chaos, a lot of times, has a really funny way of flipping the script. Okay, so the heavy rains at this time had turned the battlefield into an absolute nightmare. So the mud was thick and it was unrelenting and it would suck boots and hooves alike. So to the French, this was just an inconvenience. They still believed that their sheer numbers and superior firepower would crush the English. But to Henry V, this wasn't a disaster. This was an opportunity. And you'll notice this amongst a lot of the great military leaders throughout history is the best ones find some sort of opportunity in all of the chaos. And so what Henry did is he took advantage of a bottleneck, which if you don't know, you just think of a bottle, it gets smaller at the top, so it's harder for things to flow through. And so Henry didn't have the luxury of numbers or resources at the time, okay? Far from home, it had zero advantages. So he had to use the terrain to level the playing field. And so the battlefield was flanked by thick woods and forests on the side. And so it created this natural funneling bottleneck. And so by positioning his troops in this narrow space, Henry forced the French to funnel their massive army into a tight formation, which negated the advantage of having the numbers. Okay. And so in chaos, space becomes power. And Henry was able to control the space. And so at this time, Henry's secret weapon was his longbowman. So armed with the English longbow, a weapon that could fire faster, farther, and more accurately than anything that the French had had at the time, these longbowmen became the architects of the chaos. And so while the French knights, they struggled just to charge through the mud, the longbowmen just rained down the relentless storm of arrows. And so the French didn't stand a chance at this point because their entire army could not push through this tiny bottleneck. And so all of a sudden, they're just getting bombarded left and right. And so that same mud that weighed down the English soldiers became the French knights' downfall. So their heavy armor, which was designed to make them invincible, actually became the trap. So horses, they slipped and fell. Knights became immobilized, and their entire advance turned into just a chaotic, disorganized mess. And so what you can take away from this is Henry, he didn't try to fight the mud. He let the mud do the work for them. And a lot of times with chaos, that's what you have to do is just let it kind of do its thing and see what comes out of it. And so as the French cavalry tried to retreat, their own men-at-arms pressed forward. So these are just men on their feet with spears, whatever you want to call them. They kept pressing forward. And because of this, it caused a pileup of bodies and armor in the mud. And so the French army's just sheer size, which should have been their biggest strength, became their greatest weakness. And they were stuck, they were exposed, and they were utterly vulnerable. And so once the French charge, once it was neutralized, the English troops, though outnumbered and lightly armed, they started to push forward. And this is where you have to start thinking about the psychological benefits of just confidence and knowing like, oh shit, we have an advantage here. And so the longbowmen who had been holding the line ended up joining the fight with melee weapons, swords, maces, whatever, and started hacking their way through the mess of disorganized French soldiers. And so what should have ended up being a massacre for the English turned into an absolute massacre for the French. And so by the end of the day, there were over 10,000 French soldiers dead, including a lot of their nobles and knights. And the English, they had less than 500 total casualties. Okay, and this wasn't just a victory. This was a masterclass in how to turn chaos into an advantage. And a lot of times, in terms of the lessons that you can take away as a creator, Henry V, he didn't fight the chaos in the battlefield. He embraced it. He saw the mud not as an obstacle, but as a tool to disrupt the French strategy. And so in your own life, chaos might feel overwhelming, but it often hides the very thing that you need to succeed. Okay, and so the French relied on traditional strategies. And so if you look at a lot of creatives, traditional strategies being come up with a plan and do it every day at the same time every day because creativity comes at the same time if you do it, blah, blah, blah. Stephen King talks about it, whatever, right? But heavy cavalry charges and brute force is what the French relied on. Okay. Henry chose to adapt. And so he didn't try to beat the French army in their own game. He just changed the game entirely. And that's what you'll notice the best creatives do. They completely change the way anything is ever done. Like the biggest one. So Leonardo da Vinci, you look at him, he changed the way anybody did literally anything because he was a polymath and he was so good at so many things and he didn't have a rhyme or reason. He just kind of followed his interest and followed what he needed to do amidst his head swirling around. And I think that's a massive superpower, especially if you're like me and have ADHD, is, creativity thrives not in this like rigid control, but in adaptability. And so I think, especially if you look at today, like how society's going and technology's improving, if you can become adaptable to when things don't go as planned and you don't resist it, you just pivot, you're going to set yourself up really well. Okay. And the big thing here is constraints. Okay. Constraints can be your catalyst for creativity. And so Henry, in this case, didn't have the numbers or the resources, and the terrain wasn't ideal, but those same constraints of how the land was, the mud, the rain, forced him to think differently. Okay, and constraints aren't limitations. They're opportunities to innovate. Whether it's limited time, tools, or options, you can use those boundaries to fuel your creativity. Okay, so Henry's victory, it wasn't about brute strength. It wasn't about perfect conditions. It was about understanding that the chaos and using it to his advantage. Okay, think of the mud in your own life. What are the failures, the unpredictability, the moments when nothing is going right? Those are not the end of the road. They're the beginning. And just like Henry, you can take the chaos and you can turn it into some form of decisive victory. And so I like to think of this in terms of like when it comes to the limitations that you have, rather than thinking about like how I don't even know how I'm going to get this project done, think like how can I get this project done in the limited time I have? What tools can I use? What resources can I use? Okay, so now we can get into a little bit more of the tactical things. Okay. So the first tactic that I personally love using the most because it helps me just get raw momentum is what I call chaotic sprints. Okay. And what you're going to do here is you're just going to set a timer for 30 minutes and the whole idea is just to go. No judgment, no nothing. Put pen to paper, write, paint, brainstorm, problem solve, whatever the craft is that you have, attack it with zero hesitation. So like don't stop to edit, don't stop to think. Just ride the wave of chaos and see where it takes you. And so the reason this is so powerful is because chaotic sprints are like a creative adrenaline shot. When you stop overthinking, you bypass the whole perfectionist voice in your head and you tap into like this raw, unfiltered energy. And this is where the gold lives, the ideas that surprise even you. And so a pro tip with this is you can turn up the heat by adding some form of a chaotic element. So one of my personal favorites is either loud music. So I turn on like one of my favorite bands is Era and Bad Omens. I'll crank that shit on up to 10. I'll do that, or I'll just go to a crowded coffee shop, no headphones, but I want it to be loud. And you could even work with some unconventional tools, but you have like let the noise and the chaos around you fuel you instead of trying to fight it and get into the perfect conditions. And I think this is one of the biggest things that drives me crazy about what creators will teach people is they'll say, oh, you've got to get into a quiet place. You have to get in the same type of environment anytime you do anything creative so it's predictable. But the vast reality is for a lot of artists and creative people, especially if you have ADHD, it's like, no, the chaos is what gives you fuel. And I recognize this one day. Every time I've gone to a coffee shop and the whole purpose has been to just create stuff, I get so much more done than I do whenever I sit down here in private when it's quiet. Okay. And so the challenge I want to challenge you to is this week, set aside 30 minutes for a chaotic sprint and just let go of whatever the outcome is and focus on the energy that you bring to it, not the polish. Because believe it or not, there are some pretty incredible tools nowadays that can polish a lot of the things for you. But the part that's going to make that creative project or that thing absolutely freaking hit is going to be the energy that you bring to it, because there's some sort of untapped thing from the ether, the divine, whatever the hell you want to call it, that doesn't come from trying to be perfect or doesn't come from trying to make sure this video goes viral or anything like that. All right. And so that brings up into step 2, and that is to create constraints. And so chaos a lot of times needs a little bit of a container, kind of like lightning in a jar. And so what you want to do is limit your resources intentionally. So work with fewer resources, work with fewer tools, work with less time, or just like one singular idea. And constraints, these things force your brain to innovate. Okay. It's like how Henry used the woods to funnel the French into this narrow pass. And so the reason this works so well is because when everything is wide open, your brain freezes with too many options. Analysis paralysis. That's what happens to a lot of creators that want to start creating stuff online, is they look up all this advice and they get stuck in tutorial hell because there's so many different ways that you could go about it. But constraints, it forces you to focus your creativity, and it forces you to adapt with what you have. And think of it like working out. Your muscles grow when they're under some form of resistance. And so some examples could be like, if you're a writer, try writing a piece of content or a story using only 100 words. Okay. And watch how your brain just tries to find new ways to say more with less. Or from step 1, if you just write out a bunch of stuff, try to refine it down into under 100 words. Another way is like, if you have a problem at work, use only one tool or one method and limit your usual go-to tricks and just see what comes out of it. Record a video in a single take, no edits, no reshoots, just raw energy. That's typically how I do these. Like, I'll edit them a little bit just to take out some gaps, but like after I post it, to be honest, I never watch it again. I just let it go and go from there. But my biggest tip is just pick one creative constraint to apply to a current project that you have. Think of it as the mud on your battlefield. And so it's an obstacle that can become your biggest weapon. Okay. And so the third tactic that you can use is disrupt your routine. So shake up your system a little bit. So chaos thrives when you break out of your comfort zone. And I don't mean comfort in like it feels good. I just mean comfort in terms of it's the things that you've always done. So change something, anything about your process, your environment, or the tools to inject some form of unpredictability into your creative flow. Something I used to do whenever I'd have to go into the office for work, I would just drive a different way to work. It was that simple, but that just added a new element to my days where my days seem a little bit more exciting, a little bit more novel. Okay. And so this works so well because routine, although it's good when you actually have the steps in front of you and the exact steps you need to take in order to get there, but like it kills spontaneity. When you disrupt patterns, your brain starts to light up with new connections. And so that's why new environments or unexpected situations often lead to breakthroughs. Okay. And before I get a lot of the self-improvement YouTubers saying, oh, well, routine is the most important thing. Context, guys. We got to understand context here. The amount of comments I get from people that just have a lack of an ability to understand nuance is a little bit alarming, but it's okay. That's part of what I'm here for, and I accept you anyway. Okay, so if you always work at a desk, try working outside or in a noisy cafe, kind of like before. Switch some tools. If you write digitally, try writing out by hand. If you brainstorm alone, try to collaborate with different people, wildly different from you. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is just get other people to start so I can just talk ideas to them and bounce it off of them. So set like a bizarre challenge for yourself, like creating something in complete darkness or within an hour of waking up. That one's a good one. If you've never like started trying to create something as soon as you wake up, I highly recommend. For whatever reason, you just get different ideas and different ways of looking at things and doing things. And so lean into the discomfort and the weirdness. The point isn't to make things easier. It's to make things unpredictable. And that's where the magic happens. Okay. And so the next tactical step is celebrate the mess. Learn from chaos. So stop treating unfinished projects or failures as dead ends. Okay. The mess isn't a failure. A lot of times you're going to come back to a project that you started a long time ago. And that's the whole fucking point. Look at what didn't work and ask, what's the lesson here? What can I build on? And so this works because most people, they fear the mess because they think it means they've failed. But the mess is where all of that creativity lies. It's where you find the unexpected connections and the ideas that you couldn't necessarily see before. So go back to an unfinished project and pull out one idea that you can either salvage or continue to build on. So make a failure inventory, list your past mistakes or failed projects, and write down one thing that you took away from it. And share your messy, unfinished work with someone that you trust. See, like, hey, was this on the right, was I on the right track here? Is this good? And fresh eyes might see some of the brilliance where you see chaos. Okay, so instead of hiding your messy drafts or your failures or the things that you might think is corny or just not good, display them proudly. A lot of people, you would be shocked at how many people actually admire it and fuck with it. Okay, so treat them as stepping stones, not as dead ends. Okay, and so this is a bonus step, but find your creativity mosh pit. Okay, so channel your raw energy. So at metal shows and stuff, the mosh pit, it's not just a place for chaos. It's a place where people kind of let go and connect with just pure raw energy. And so find your version of that, a place or activity where you can let loose and recharge your creative batteries. And so, this is because creativity, it's not just about producing to get an outcome. It's about tapping into the energy of life. Okay, the mosh pit is a metaphor for finding that space where you can lose yourself and come back energized. So go to a live event, go to a concert, go to a show, music, art, anything that inspires chaos and energy. Try a physical activity that gets you out of your head. Hiking, boxing, dancing, snowboarding, skiing, something adrenaline heavy. Spend time with people who challenge your ideas or introduce new perspectives, like especially people that you maybe disagree with, like politically even. I know it can be a hot topic, but a lot of times you can hear new perspectives that can kind of open your mind up to things that maybe you would close yourself off to before. And so I highly recommend just making time for chaos in your life, whether it's through an event, a creative jam session, or just a wild brainstorming session with friends, because this is where you're going to recharge. Okay. And so if you take anything away from this, chaos, it's not something to fear. Okay. It's something to use. Whether you're sprinting through ideas, adapting to constraints, disrupting your routine, or learning from the mess, every chaotic moment holds the potential for brilliance. Okay. And all that you have to do is lean into it.